Hiba, would you like to talk a little bit more about your role and your perspective on climate justice?
Yes. So, hi, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. I'm Hiba. I'm an Iraqi migrant who grew up in Sweden and who moved to the UK to study, but then found herself kind of stuck around this strange little island. And I've been for the past 6 years or so. I'm involved in a collective called Our Future Now. We are linked to Global Justice Now, so we're part of their youth network, but we also do things on our own. And we're a group of young people who are passionate about like systemic change to the issues we're seeing. And we organize on issues of climate justice and migrant justice. So for us, that means everything from political education to taking direct action, to writing about things, to doing a bunch of other stuff. So yeah, that's me.
Great. And would you like to say a little bit about your perspective, just an introductory view of climate justice from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I think like climate justice for me is just, it's kind of like almost a materialization of all the issues we're seeing. So I think it's kind of like issues of, you know, racism, sexism, homophobia, all of these things combined into like, you know, into our very materiality. So I think that, you know, for us to be able to tackle this issue, we have to understand our role in the system, and we have to understand how it works so we can start fighting back against it. So yeah, I'll be talking a little bit more about that as well later on.
Great. Thank you so much. Nick, would you like to go next?
Yeah, definitely. So I run Global Justice Now, and we've existed with a different name, but since 1970, which obviously was a very different political situation to what we find ourselves in now. There was all sorts of hope for a very different sort of global economy, of internationalism. And I wouldn't describe myself ever really, you know, maybe up until recently as an environmentalist. I came to this subject through a very different route, which was really looking at challenging global inequality, critiquing a global economy which treats most countries in the world as suppliers of cheap resources, of cheap labor, and of captive markets. And then looking specifically at how the rules we create, the trade rules, the financial rules, even sometimes international development spending, is part and parcel of embedding that relationship between the global north and the global south, the haves and the have-nots, and what we can do to combat that and to change it and to challenge it. And it took me a while actually to understand the importance of climate change in that, because I always remember seeing climate change as something which seemed to be about the future, and also to focus a lot on lifestyle changes. And I was very interested in structural change, and I was very interested in the fact that, you know, if we're going to critique the food system, we have a food system which already leaves 1 billion people on the verge of starvation. You know, that needs dealing with now, not at 20 years in the future. That was how I felt back kind of 10, 15 years ago. And it took me a while to realize how the issues were one and the same in many ways, that this global economy that we've got that treats people simply as, you know, materials to extract stuff from, is the same economy that treats the environment, the planet, as something that as a bit of material that we just extract things from. We extract wealth from to build profits at the top of our society, and how the global economy that's developed over the last 40 years, particularly, I mean, in some senses this goes back to the roots of industrial capitalism, of course, but, you know, for tonight's purposes, let's focus on the last 40 years where we have this kind of economy that's built in this idea that the purpose, the driver, the main driver behind economics is to strive to extract in order to profit some very, very handsomely, at the expense of thrusting costs back onto ordinary people, to our planet, to future generations, and that we can't deal with these issues in silos. That if we want to combat and challenge this global economy, we've got to take a very holistic picture. And so, for me, climate justice is really, you know, lifestyle changes are well and good, but unless and until we can create this structural change, we're not going to be able to either find ourselves with a livable climate or or deal with an economy where people are treated like human beings first and foremost, not simply tools. Essentially. So that one very important point for me is the structural point. Very quickly, the second aspect of climate justice for me is that clearly it affects some people much more than others. Of course, it affects all of us, but there are frontline communities in this struggle who are most seriously and severely affected. Their lives and livelihoods are existentially threatened by climate change. And I believe that change comes from below. Change comes from grassroots movements. At some point, politicians will take it up, the media will take it up, whatever, and that means you've won something. But essentially, that fundamental change comes from below. And if we really believe that, then the fight for a better economy has to come from those who are most dispossessed. And the fight against climate change has to come from those on the front line. And so we act in solidarity with them. So I really see my work as solidarity work with those in the front line of this struggle against a deeply unequal and inequitable global economy.
Great, thanks so much, Nick. Rachel, would you like to go next?
Thank you. Yeah, so hi, I'm Rachel Kennerley. I work for Friends of the Earth England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and I'm the international climate campaigner there, which basically means I try and make sure that we take kind of a globally just approach to our climate work while being kind of in the UK and being a nationally based organisation. So, for example, I look at how the UK does lots of public financing of fossil fuel infrastructure abroad. So we talk a great talk about how we're cutting our emissions at home, but we completely ignore and refuse to take responsibility for kind of all the emissions we create elsewhere because they're in a different country, so they don't count towards our targets. And as for climate justice, I think it's very easy in UK climate organisations and in some climate activism spaces for climate justice to kind of be spoken about a lot, but not understood and certainly not acted upon in any meaningful way, particularly when it comes to solutions and how we try and stop climate breakdown. And I think, I'm going to admit, I realised quite late in life, I suppose, that that realisation that one, climate justice injustice really does exist, and that neither the impacts nor the responsibility for the climate crisis are equally distributed at all. And that isn't random or coincidental. That distribution of kind of climate injustice just amplifies all the other injustices in society, both nationally and internationally. And as with all these other injustices we see, it's all about power structures and inequality. And whereas kind of on a day-to-day basis, lots of people kind of accept them as normal, and the climate crisis really lays that bare, where kind of those dividing lines are. So, for example, when Hurricane Katrina hit the US, which I'm sure we all remember, and I'm sure we all know or remember that it was Black communities who were most impacted by Hurricane Katrina and struggled to recover from it. But within that community, it was Black women who struggled most to recover. And within that community, it was Black trans women, most of all, that struggled to recover. And so you have kind of this layering of injustices that the climate crisis just exacerbates even further. And so for me, and for climate justice, a solution to the climate crisis can't leave anybody behind. It can't just work for one part of the population, especially not kind of the mainstream population. Otherwise, it's not a solution. So for a very relevant example right now, we can't shut down all fossil fuel industries without supporting the people who work in those industries. That's not justice. If we reduce emissions through protecting forests around the world, we can't do this by excluding the indigenous people who live on that land. That's not climate justice. If people are moving out of flood zones because they're just flooding constantly and you can't live there anymore, what happens to the discriminated against communities who can't afford to move? And it's questions like that about how we actually address climate change and come up with the solutions that I think is where climate justice is really important and really lies. And people often characterize that as that it's a choice between two mutually exclusive things, right? That you can either solve climate change or you can solve climate breakdown, or we can keep people in jobs. You can either solve climate breakdown or you can reduce poverty. You can either solve climate breakdown or you can respect indigenous rights. And it's like, I'm not pretending it's easy, but climate justice for me is doing all of those things at once, and doing them all together. And I think really that's the only way to kind of make that progress.
That's great. Thanks so much, Rachel. Okay, and last but certainly not least, Sheila.
Hi. So yeah, I work for Ulex. I'm currently in Catalonia working for Ulex, coordinating training projects for courses that we run here, broadly around the themes of regenerative activism, and also working on a strand of training to support specific needs of POC activists. My introduction into...
Sorry, do you want to explain what POC is, just in case?
Sorry, yeah, for people of colour, so activists who are people of colour and activist trainers who work in communities of colour. So yeah, about 6 years ago, I got sucked into grassroots climate activism in the UK, but I got quite quickly burnt out a few years later and had to step back. And it was a really great opportunity for me to look at what had contributed to that burnout, and to reflect on the fact that the movement in the UK is so white middle class, and why I was the only brown face in the room, which was something that I encountered a lot. And that kind of put me into a journey exploring my own identity as a British South Asian woman of colour, and my politics of race and gender, and how they relate to both the climate movement and the climate crisis. And I guess what I realise is, like, a lot of groups refer to their work. I hear groups referring to their work on climate change as climate justice, but sometimes it feels like it's being used as the latest term to use when talking about climate change, because they're still talking about climate change as an ecological crisis that's caused by human nature, broadly speaking. And it feels like the real meaning of the term and the focus on justice is kind of ironically absent. So for me, climate justice really means understanding that climate change is a crisis of inequality, that it's only made possible by the fact that we live in an unjust world that's governed by patriarchal, capitalist and colonial structures, structures that are founded on centuries of systemic oppression and inequality, and that it also creates structural oppression and inequality, because our ability to mitigate and adapt are inevitably shaped by things like race or class, gender, sexuality, physical ability, income, political representation, nationality. I mean, the list goes on. And these inequalities are just getting bigger as the crisis gets worse, because the more inequality or oppression we experience, then the less resources or choices we have access to. So I think it's important that we recognise with climate justice that it's not just broadly caused by human nature. It's primarily caused by specific activities of a global minority of people who are generally more powerful and privileged, while the people who are being impacted most by those activities and the consequence of those activities are a global majority who are generally more oppressed and more marginalised, and of course the least damaged, as we've already heard some people say. So it's climate justice is based on a principle of equity, where our attention is focused on those who are most impacted, and those who are most responsible should have a bigger role to play in fixing the problem. And I guess I just wanted to pull out, there were 27 principles of climate justice that were adopted by environmental groups about 20 years ago. And I thought it would be really interesting to pull a couple of them out. So these were just three. Climate justice affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples and affected communities to represent and speak for themselves. It affirms that affected communities play a leading role in processes, both national and international, to address climate change. And climate justice demands that public policy be based on mutual respect and justice for all peoples, free from any form of discrimination or bias. So when we talk about climate justice, we really need to be seeing it and talking about it not as an ecological issue, but as a socio-political issue. And it's not just about the consequences of climate change, but it's also about the systemic causes of climate change and the impact that they're having on people. We need to be listening to people and taking a lead from those who are most affected, and we need our thinking and our, like what we're doing, our messaging, our actions, our campaigning to be based on the inequalities and oppressions and injustices that are inextricably linked to this crisis.
Thanks so much, Sheila. Thanks so much to our panel. I think that's whetted everyone's appetite for our further questions. So I kind of see this event as a bit like it's got a Shrek type approach in that we do layers like onions. So we're now going a layer down, which is when I ask each of our panel members a specific question, which they will answer in detail, but it's absolutely open to other members of the panel to also jump in once they finish, if they've got other things to add. So it's not quite the same as a in-person dialogue, but we're trying to edge towards that a little bit. So starting off with Nick, question for you, Nick, is the climate crisis as much about power and politics as it is about the environment?
It definitely is, because as I think everybody's said in their openings, this is not accidental. This is born out of the nature of our global economy, which is, all about power and politics. It's an economy that was created. It's not just something that materialized by accident. Particularly the neoliberal economy, this really extreme version of capitalism that we've seen over the last 4 decades, was created on the back of a debt crisis in the developing world. It was called the Third World Debt Crisis at the time, which through marginalized many countries and threw out this project that many countries that had become free of the chains of colonialism were trying to embark upon to create a fairer economy. Really exciting stuff happening in the 70s. The United Nations adopting in 1975 this idea of a new international economic order. Now, it didn't have the environment at the heart of it because, most politics weren't kind of there at the moment, but it did have a very, very different sort of economy that would not have taken us down the road that we were taken down of this extreme version of extractivism, embedding the need for profit maximization throughout the whole of our society. Saying the only role of government is basically to get out of the way and leave it to the market, and the market will produce all good things to us. And there's a lot of this is rhetoric, so I want to maybe drill down a little bit and give you an example of what this looks like in practice. I work a lot on trade and trade deals because trade policy and trade rules have become absolutely central to how the global economy works. And some people think, well, if you just allow, free trade, everyone's going to benefit from free trade. If we have free trade policies in place, eventually everybody will become prosperous and growth will lift all boats. And the market is a great way to decide how resources are allocated in society. And of course, it's when you actually look at what it means in practice, it's nothing to do with that whatsoever. And it's actually, these rules have created some of the worst inequality in the world in history, and also have fueled climate change to an extraordinary extent. Now, one reason for that is you have the idea in modern trade rules of endless liberalization and endless growth. I mean, that's kind of what the model is based upon. So trade agreements, trade deals, and trade rules are all about forcing endless liberalization. That's a disaster for the public sector because it forces the liberalization of the public sector. It encourages privatization by giving rights to international investors over public services and the public sector. That's a disaster for climate change in itself, actually, because a lot of the low carbon jobs in our economy are public sector jobs, but also by removing the power of the state to look after people and protect people, and turning our healthcare into a commodity and turning our education into commodity and speeding up the commodification of our society. You're actually part and parcel of creating this very, very unsustainable and unequal economy. You've got things like industrial agriculture, which has been massively helped by the global trading system, because the global trading system regards regards price as the only thing that matters, essentially. So standards and workers' rights are driven down because every country, every industry has to compete against every other country and every other industry in the world, and they slash costs, and that's a disaster for the environment. So many people will know here in Britain at the moment, there's a lot of attention on the possibility of a US trade deal. One of the things that we're really worried about from a US trade deal is the importation of industrial agricultural practices into Britain, because our farmers would simply not be able to compete in free market conditions with chickens that are, produced in the most horrific battery intensive conditions, pigs that are filled with all sorts of chemicals and hormones to allow them to grow in really awful conditions. It's clearly really bad for the animals. It's bad for the environment. It's not good for farmers that are trying to produce things in another way. But this is how the trade system works in order to kind of drive down standards. And the same thing right the way across the board. It kind of builds in this deregulation, this liberalization of everything in our society, turning everything in our society into a commodity. It creates free markets in fuels. Right? So it makes it more difficult for governments to discriminate between different types of fuels, because that's against the law of allowing the market to decide. Right? So you have things called energy neutrality clauses being discussed now in certain trade deals, which would make it really, really hard to operate a kind of Green New Deal, because it would make it hard for governments to discriminate against fossil fuels. And then to cap this all off, it kind of comes with its own legal system. It has these things that we call corporate courts or investor-state dispute settlement systems, which basically give big capital, like big foreign investors and big corporations, the right to sue governments for doing virtually anything they don't like, virtually anything that challenges their profits. So it's kind of a charter for the global 1%. It's a charter for big business. And it means that any attempts that governments take to challenge that, to regulate in the public interest or to regulate on behalf of the environment, so to speak, can be challenged by capital. It's not hard to see how that is, given that we have a world of limited resources, it is simply not possible to continue growing and to continue liberalizing in this way. And so you have a fundamental problem that our global economy is on this track where this is what it has to do. It's embedded in rules at the World Trade Organization. It's embedded in bilateral trade rules between, and yet it's killing us. It's killing our planet, and it's creating massive inequality. It's creating pandemics. I mean, look at the role of, we're all sitting at home at the moment because of a virus that in part has been created by the devastation of wildlife habitats and bringing us further into contact with wild animals. So it's an absolute unmitigated disaster, but it continues and continues because that's the logic of the system. And so we've got to challenge that. I mean, there is no way out of that, which is saying, fine, if people want to kind of opt out of that system and live in a different way, I completely respect that. But ultimately, you have to change the logic of the system. Ultimately, you need that structural change to change the logic of the system. And so that's what we try to do. And it's not to say, that we shouldn't trade with anybody else, but it's to say the basis of that trade needs to be fundamentally different. It needs to be about regulating and controlling the way that economic actors can behave in the world, so that we can preserve the environment, and also we can create a better society, which is based on equality and dignity of human life, and so on and so forth. And that's a political debate. It's a political it's a political fight, and it's about challenging power. And
do you think, and I know it's very hard to do any crystal ball gazing at the moment because we are in a state of flux, but do you think where we are might sort of tip public opinion against some of the things that are quite inherent to trade policy?
I mean, you have to hope, and I hope so, and I think it's perfectly possible. So I absolutely don't rule it out. I mean, I think we're at a crossroads where it is perfectly evident to the vast majority of people in the world that the system that we are living in is not sustainable, and we need to find a way out of it. And that way out of it could be towards the Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Modis, the strongmen, the populist strongmen, in a very similar way to the role that fascism played in the 1930s as a way out of this kind of unsustainable free market economy. It looks a bit different now, but I think it's basically the same kind of idea. Or yes, we democratize our economy and we make it work for the public good. And you can see signs of both things happening. And for me, our job as activists is to push the side that we want, the democratic side, much more heavily, because none of this is inevitable. There's no inevitability about which way we will go. It all depends upon us. And I know we're going to talk about regeneration later on, and how we keep ourselves kind of sane in this situation, and don't put all of the pressure on ourselves constantly to change the world. But collectively, it is about the power that we bring to the situation that we're in, that will decide which way we go. And there are definitely positives there. I mean, look at, people are going to be out here clapping in 15 minutes time for the NHS. That's extremely positive in terms of reaffirming the need for public health care at a global level, and saying, no, the market will not provide this. This is not a commodity. It's our right as human beings. And I think you can make those arguments right across society, and they apply to the environment as well.
Thanks so much. Anyone else on our panel want to offer any thoughts on this question? I'm going to put you on speaker view because I can't see. I think I get the sense that's a very comprehensive answer from Nick, which we're not getting, but that's great. So in that case, I will move on to our second question, which is for Hiba, which is, how can we ensure that the societal transformation needed to address climate change promotes justice and equalities for communities and countries?
Thank you, Gita, and thanks to all the speakers so far. It's been great. Just want to back up a little bit about, I think Rachel mentioned this, that when we're talking about climate solutions, it's often put as either or, like you either have climate justice or you solve the environmental issue, or you have an economic system that works the way it is. And I think the way we think about it is we unnecessarily decouple ideas of justice and equality from the communities they involve, because I don't really think we can have climate solutions that aren't embedded in social justice. Because as I said before, I think that climate change is a material manifestation of all of the injustices that are inbuilt into our socioeconomic hierarchies. So I see it as sexism, racism, ableism, homophobia materializing into our environment, seeping into our airways and into our waterways, into the food we eat and to the materials we put on our bodies. So it's economic injustice in a way, because the toxins that we see, they're your exposure to them is highly dependent on your economic status. So the poorer you are, the likelihood of these things happening to you are much higher. And it's also that because the rich of the world can afford, they can afford to continue fleeing from devastating consequences that their lifestyles actually have put us through. And they flee to their second, third, fourth home. They have passports that can take them everywhere. Whereas most people, once they're displaced, they're displaced. Most of us don't own homes. So being displaced is that deep and real trauma. Climate change is rooted in racism and in colonialism, because it thrives off a global order which values northern rich lives above the rest. And it's colonialism and racism because it pitches global solutions to climate emergencies, which put undue burdens of adaptation and mitigation on poorer colonized peoples, as you mentioned before, Gita. So it puts us in this idea forward that we're all in this together, when actually some of us are much more in it than others. But we can't talk about that, because then we're taking away from the emergency of it all. And the same boatism, as I like to call it, is just deeply unfair and ahistorical. And it's also racist, because it tells the scale of a population growth eating the earth as we know it, eating it bare, while the capitalist system throws away 1.3 billion tons of edible food per year. Now, to put it into perspective, this is just a third of all food produced each year, so it's a tremendous amount. And it's also sexism, because women suffer from this more. We take a lot of the burdens from this crisis, and it's homophobia because LGBT communities are more marginalized, so they feel it more. It's ableism because disabled people are put at more at risk due to their marginalized status, and they're less likely to be helped or listened to. So what I'm trying to get at is that solutions that are not based in this intersectional understanding of the crisis that we're in, that sees how our class and and our backgrounds shape the way we can move and have power within this. They're not actually solutions. They are kind of greenwashing at best, so they make companies look good, or they are green colonialism or eco-fascism at worst, which is what I believe, but that's one way of looking at it. So I think unless we deploy a deep, reflective and engaging stakeholder dialogue that puts everyone equally at the table and also recognizes historical injustice, we're just not going to have a solution. Now, what that concretely means is that the UK and the rest of the global north need to take real steps at degrowing the economy. So scaling it back, divesting from fossil fuels and other terrible industries. And also another way of doing this degrowing is redistribution. So we're talking about reparations in a way. So you do reparations in form of justice. You acknowledge the injustices that you've done onto the world, all of the wealth that's been stolen from colonized communities, and you address it through economic reparations by paying back some of this wealth that's been stolen, but also through acknowledging the historical injustices and paying tribute to the communities that have been lost. Now, this isn't going to solve all the wounds, but I think that economically it will give communities a chance to recover and regain a dignity that's been stolen from them. And it will also stop the race at the bottom that's at the heart of this capitalist machinery. I think when we're thinking about just transitions, I like to put it in 4 solutions. So first, we divest from the industries killing us. We degrow from the remaining northern economy that enable all of the devastation we're seeing, really. We decolonize from the mentality at the heart of the injustice, and we redistribute the wealth hoarded up by the few in the global north to create a better world for all. So yeah, sorry, I know it's very high level, but I think we have to keep thinking that way, and we have to start envisioning it to get to that stage.
No, that's great. It's great to have that sort of sense of that framework and sense in that broader context. So thanks so much, Hiba. Anyone else from our panel want to comment or add further thoughts on that?
I can just kind of reiterate from kind of things you see at the in the UN climate process that I'm in, that kind of we're all in this together, we're all in the same boat, and it's so dangerous and so untrue, and it's been an absolute success of kind of a lot of the governments and countries that have caused the majority of climate change, that they are getting away with that. So yeah, just a big agree on that.
Thanks, Rachel.
Sheila?
Yeah, again, really echoing everything that Hiba said, really awesome. But just a question that comes to my mind when we're talking about our demands and our solutions, and actually, yeah, just our campaigning messaging is we talk about saving humanity, but I think we don't always hear people asking who are we saving, whose lives are we prioritizing when we're coming up with our demands and our solutions and our tactics and our strategies, as if saving humanity is one whole, we're saving everyone, but we're not saving everybody equally in the way that climate change is not impacting everybody equally. So yeah, it was just a question that came to mind.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, and it just came in, and when Nick was speaking earlier as well, it also, it's very, I know there's writing happening about some of the parallels between COVID and climate change, but you see this happening now. You see the kind of economic imperative of keeping things going, and you have the imperative of health and people's lives, and you see what decisions are being made in terms of whose lives are more important and more valuable than others. So I don't know if anyone on the panel has any sort of reflections in terms of, and as I say, it's early days, but that angle of things, and what the COVID response is perhaps showing us on this issue.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I think COVID has kind of shown us that like the systems we have today that we're kind of told are very resilient, and we're trying, like I work in international development in my day job as an analyst, and like we're constantly going out there like giving technical assistance to other countries, saying like, this is what a resilient system looks like. This is a system that can handle shocks. This is a system that's going to withstand pressure. When actually, when you look at the UK, like where is this resilience we're talking about? Like, you know, you have a very classist system in place that is basically jeopardizing the life of working people, of elderly people, of people that are like on the margins of society. And I think like this is really like, you know, climate change at speed. And the thing that also like really pisses me off is that it's like, it's also made us look very like geographically inwards. So when we're talking about COVID, it's always like, oh, you know, what's going to happen with the UK and so on. When like actually the ravages of it, I mean, this disease was kind of, in a way, the child of globalization. It was it spread far and wide due to the economic system we see today, with lots of travel and unfettered borders for some people and very big borders for other people. So the people that spread it actually are the rich people that are also benefiting from the devastation of climate change. And they're still like not being made to pay for it. Like we're not seeing, you know, more taxation on billionaires, for example, where we're kind of like taking it for granted that they can just go on the way they want to, really. And all sorts of all of the stimulus packages that are kind of being drawn up, they're propping up the same companies that have put us here to begin with. So it's been really, yeah. I like the comment that came up, it's resilient against changes, like it really is. So this is why we need to kind of start calling it out, I think, and I really kind of putting a highlight on it, because this is this is basically climate change, but in a much faster forwarded way.
Yeah, it's almost like a, you know, ghost of future showing us like this is where we're headed, and some of that actually happening now and coming into play now. Anyone else want to offer any thoughts on that before I go to the next question? Looks like a no. So I will. I'm also just going to say that I will cut. I've had a request to cut and paste the questions into the chat box, so I will do that also. So this next question is for Rachel. Rachel, what's the role of movements, both national and international, in bringing about climate justice?
Oh, thank you. So yeah, I'm not going to go into like a big history of how movements have basically created all the big justice-based progressions we've had in society. I hope people are aware of that, but I'm going to look specifically kind of at within the climate space and kind of what's happening now and the role they've had in the last few years and in the future. For me, the way I see it, like, within the climate space, movements bring the demands, they set the bar, they bring the drive and the momentum towards most of the changes and progress we see. We, and I mean me as kind of like a representative of the predominantly white middle class kind of professionalised environmental movement in the UK, really need to listen to them and back them up, those movements, and because we don't very much at the moment at all. In the UK in particular, from my experience anyway, it's all too easy to just focus on what the UK does domestically. So we look at our emissions, we look at how we're protecting our people, our flood defences, that sort of thing. And we completely ignore the fact that climate breakdown caused by the emissions that we're responsible for as a rich global north country is impacting other people in their countries already in devastating ways, and indigenous and marginalised people closer to home as well. It's not just an international thing. This is happening, you know, I used that example from the US and Hurricane Katrina earlier for a reason. It's like it's impacting people in kind of global north countries as well. And because of this kind of like narrow focus on kind of domestic kind of sensibilities and this very narrow definition of kind of climate impacts, we too many organisations and decision makers and people thinking and talking about climate change start from, when they're thinking about demands and pathways, they start from thinking about what we're prepared to do, what seems feasible, what seems politically acceptable. And very few actually start from where we need to be and then work backwards to how we actually achieve that, which is really what, if you want to stay below 1.5 degrees of global warming, you need to work out what you need to do to achieve that, not what you fancy doing. And the one really clear example of this is in the UN climate talks. So every country in the world shows up to the climate talks to supposedly come together to work out how the global community, everybody together, will keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. It will probably shock none of you to realise that that is not actually what happens. What actually happens is a load of the rich global north countries who've done the most to cause climate change rock up and refuse to take responsibility for those emissions historically and currently. And then a load of kind of countries from the global south who've done the least to cause climate change and suffer the worst impacts and have the least resources to cut emissions and to deal with those impacts, basically ask for help and say, we can't cope with these impacts, and we can't expect to make these emissions reductions that we didn't do this. I have somewhat oversimplified global politics there. But that's the basic dynamic. That countries try to negotiate what they want to do, not what they need to do. And that is, as was reflected in Nick's question, answer to that first question, that is all about power dynamics and all about political will, and is normally just colonial power structures, but reskinned for a modern era. And that basically allows a lot of countries to get away with this we're all in this together approach that really masks those structural power imbalances that are at play globally and really forces quite obviously the burden of emission reductions and climate impacts onto the countries that didn't create the mess in the first place, but are dealing with the worst consequences. So it very much shifts the burden onto the poorer countries, the countries that have done least to cause climate change. But to bring it back to movements, not to be too doom-mongery about the international climate process, but movements in that space really they force reality into that space. They bring the reality check. They show what's happening on the ground to real people. They see those structural inequalities and injustices, and they work to bring that reality to light. They know what needs to happen and what needs to be done, and are pushing for that rather than what is palatable or politically acceptable. They make those demands, and there's many successes that you can point to. One of them is within the UN climate talks, there's a thing called the Indigenous and Local Peoples Platform, and that was Indigenous movements pushing for representation in that space. And that wasn't handed to them on a platter. They fought for that, and they made those demands, and they really pushed for it. So yeah, movements really set the bar for where we need to get to based on reality and what's actually happening to real people. And they also, along with that, they bring a lot of the solutions to these complex, unjust problems that play out on a global scale, because many of these grassroots communities and grassroots movements are facing those injustices. And so they can really, you can't create these solutions to these big global problems without having the people who are impacted in the room, those directly impacted people. They have the experience, they know what's going on, they know how to solve, or they can contribute to knowing how to solve them. They're really they're voices that we don't hear in the solutions discussion nearly enough. Movements, both nationally and internationally, really also bring the drive, the momentum behind change and to make change happen. Power, nobody cedes power to somebody else without being forced to, right? That's a really bad rephrasing of quite a famous quote that I have definitely got wrong. But the system doesn't change itself. Something has to happen to move the status quo, and that's where movements come in. They push that change where otherwise they would not be given those concessions. An example again from the UN climate talks sphere is, the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement signed in 2015 kind of agreed to aim to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. And that was a massive win, that 1.5 degrees in there, because before 2015, most NGOs, most governments were talking about 2 degrees of warming being the acceptable limit. And 2 degrees of warming is devastating. You can wave goodbye to coral reefs at 2 degrees, like environmentally it's terrible. You can probably also wave goodbye to the kind of all the people who rely on coral reefs for food. 2 degrees is absolutely devastating for the planet, for people. But Global South movements campaigned for years on to get 1.5 into kind of the mainstream, using slogans like 1.5 and we might survive, because they knew that 2 degree limit would be so disastrous for millions of their people in the Global South and for their countries. They really brought the reality of what that 2 degrees would mean into the climate talks, and it took years, but they brought the demand, they drove it home, they kept up that momentum, and in 2015, that 1.5 degrees limit was enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So that's just one kind of bit of kind of one of the roles that movements have had, and it's really important to have. But it's worth saying, I've mainly talked about kind of international movements, but movements are also local and national and regional, and they're all important and all kind of important to be kind of listening to and linked up to. Listening to, believing and ceding space to the demands and experiences of Global South Indigenous and marginalised people and communities and movements is really essential, especially so at the moment, because obviously our world has been turned upside down by the coronavirus, and that's meant that the job and the existence, in fact, of many movements has got a lot tougher and a lot more dangerous. Obviously, much organising of movements has moved online where possible, and that's been brilliant. We've seen some real powerful examples of activism under social distancing, including in the UK, a real kind of active mutual aid kind of movement has grown up to support people through the corona crisis. But that's not the same story everywhere, and it's certainly not possible for everyone to kind of just move online. For example, since restrictions on movement began, we've seen some governments, companies and other kind of institutions using lockdown as cover for building pipelines against community consent in Canada. And there's even been examples of kind of militia tracking down and killing activists under lockdown, for example, in Colombia. So it really has been that corona, like climate change, has really intensified a lot of these pre-existing inequalities in movements, and the kind of now more than ever, like these are the people we ought to be listening to and believing and giving space to. And my cat has just knocked over my cup of tea.
I love that. I bet your cat is an activist too and is just echoing that point. Hi, Rachel's cat. So yeah, I think absolutely it's movements bring so much vitality and energy and truth and solutions, and kind of almost reset all the despair that you feel whenever you get to the sort of the political structures and space. So thanks so much for speaking to that. Would anyone else on our panel like to offer any thoughts on this question? Okay, that's looking like a no, so comprehensive answer from Rachel, that covered it all. Right, so I'm going to now move on to a question about regenerative culture for Sheila. I am going to say at this stage, we're going to have seen there's some questions in the chat box, which I'm sure Cristobal is keeping an eye on. We've got another couple of questions, and then we'll be going to breakout groups. So if you do have a question at this point, do type it in over the next sort of 5-10 minutes or so that we can make sure we have them while you're in the breakout groups, and then Cristobal can collate them and have them ready for our panel. So back to the question for Sheila, which is, as the sense of urgency escalates and the power balance tips further out of favour, how can we foster a regenerative culture in our movements?
So, thank you. Well, I think to understand what we mean by regenerative culture is something that moves beyond the idea of sustainability. It does more than just sustain itself. So if you think of nature, it renews itself with resilience and it flourishes as it grows. It's composed of a rich diversity of elements that all are like interrelated, interconnected, interdependent. And it doesn't see itself as separate from nature, which I think is also really important. So a regenerative culture in the climate movement really has to recognize how different struggles and injustices are all interconnected and interdependent, and how they all intersect. Because if we're not looking at the issues related to climate change in this intersectional way, and we don't, if we're not looking at the issues in related to climate change with this intersectional lens, then we're not being intersectional in our analysis. And if we're not doing that, that means we're ignoring or overlooking some of the injustices that are just woven into the fabric of climate change. And if we're not being intersectional in our analysis, then we can't be intersectional in our demands or our solutions, which means that we aren't creating the kind of new systems that will create and give rise to the kind of just transitions that Hiba was talking about, which we need to see. And so so if we're not doing that, then we are almost certainly replicating and reproducing the same systems of oppression that have led us to this climate crisis in the first place. That's without that intersectional lens, we're basically not creating a regenerative culture. I guess thinking about our analysis, well, patriarchy and capitalism, as we've seen, obviously underpin the climate crisis. But if we think about nature, patriarchy and capitalism colonize nature. They're always looking for like confirmation and validation of their concepts and structures, and defining even what's understood as natural. If we think about terms like survival of the fittest and our way of viewing that, and it positions humanity as something that's separate to the environment or separate to nature. And in fact, it's the same kind of colonization that feeds like homophobic and transphobic narratives around what's nature and what's natural. And the activities and industries that are contributing to the climate crisis are grounded in this principle of like inequality and inequity, where, and we've heard Rachel talking about this already, where certain lives, certain lands and cultures are just not valued as much as others. In a lecture that Naomi Klein gave a few years ago, Edward Said lecture, she referred to these as sacrificial zones. And so whether that's indigenous lands that are being sacrificed by governments for extractive industries to colonize and destroy for furthering economic growth, or whether it's communities who are being forcibly displaced, whether it's due to extractive industries or climate disasters or conflict over resource depletion, or whether it's communities whose homes are right next to operational sites of polluting industries, and their healths are impacted because of a lack of clean air or clean water, or the people who work in toxic, dangerous, precarious conditions, usually with no workers' rights or very little workers' rights in civil protections, or whether it's people living in poverty with little or no state support, while polluting industries get subsidised and then bailed out in times of crisis, which is what we're seeing right now with coronavirus. And a classic example is like airline industries being bailed out. So when we talk about climate change, certainly in the global north, I still hear all too often that it's framed around abstract scientific terms like CO2 emissions and global temperature rise, which are obviously an important part of the conversation, or that it's around ecological loss of flora and fauna, and obviously the polar bears being the classic example. But when these are the ways that climate change is being talked about, without also talking about the cost of human lives impacted by the causes and consequences of climate change elsewhere in the world, then this is what we're seeing, and I'm seeing this a lot. Then we're still talking about something that's going to happen at some point in the future, even if that future is only 12 years away, without talking about social, economic, racial injustices that are happening. As governments get increasingly repressive and keep failing to act proportionately to like the magnitude of this crisis, like inevitably this fuels our rage. And as our sense of urgency kind of around the ecological collapse gets heightened, and like the failure and government's failure to take action on justice just gets amplified. But I've often, or our failure, like people, you know, groups, it's something that happens. And I've often heard environmental activists saying, because we can't work on race, we can't take that into account because I don't have time or capacity to work on those other issues. And I've heard that so many times from environmental activists and campaigners. So we're still seeing environmental campaigns that are still competing for attention with other movements. They're still seeing their issues as separate. They're still failing to join the dots of all these interlinked struggles. And that means that our demands and our actions and our solutions are still failing to serve the interests of everyone and still othering those whose interests they exclude. And I guess, like, I don't know if everyone's familiar with the term of othering, but it's basically the act of disregarding the legitimacy of other people or another people, another culture or another geographical region, and depriving them of the same level of humanity and rights. And it more often than not, as has already been highlighted, is Indigenous communities of colour who disproportionately bear that burden, which gives rise to what we know as environmental racism. If we want our culture, the culture of our climate movements, to be truly regenerative, and then we need to work towards a vision that values all human life as equal. We need to decolonize our ways of thinking in order to actively challenge the systemic oppressions of capitalism, patriarchy, and racism that are underpinning the climate crisis. We need strategies that are rooted in anti-oppression thinking. We need to explore our own complicity in upholding those oppressions. We need a diversity of actions, diversity of tactics and solutions, but that speak to these multiple oppressions, and don't other those who we don't have the capacity to include. I say, being quote, don't have the capacity to include. Our practice needs to be intersectional, basically. We need an intersectional approach that actively strengthens the connections between these different movements, struggles and crises. And there are multiple crises operating here, layer upon layer. And we need to take that intersectional approach so that those who are already experiencing multiple injustices aren't othered and oppressed even more. Because I think Rachel said earlier on, we can't solve all of these crises one at a time. Like, we need to be solving these all together. And in terms of like the sense of urgency, well, there's another sense of urgency, which is the sense of urgency for vulnerable populations, where the causes and consequences. And I emphasize that because often we talk about the consequences and we're not also looking at like the industries and that are causing and climate change and the kind of social injustices that are created as a result of that activity. And so, yeah, there's a sense of urgency for these vulnerable populations where the causes and consequences of climate change are like already and increasingly so making it an issue of life or death. And I guess, like, to be a bit more hopeful, I guess we also need to be taking this like intersectional approach, because I believe like this is the only way that we can build a movement that is resilient, that is robust, and that is able to truly challenge and dismantle all of these powerful forces that are underpinning the climate crisis.
So much, Sheila. And I think this idea of competing for attention is really important and powerful as well, because you do get that sense sometimes with the sector. And just to say that the Naomi Klein article you mentioned will be sent out as part of the follow-up to this session, and our next session is entirely focused on our relationship as humans with nature and the imbalances in that. So we'll definitely be going more into that. In order to just keep us moving time-wise, I think what I'll do is I'll move us on to our final question, and then if anyone has any follow-up responses to Sheila's answer, we can also kind of cover that now and in questions as well a little bit later on. So this final question is, acting on climate change can be exhausting and dispiriting. So what would you say is the relationship between self-care and developing personal resilience and climate justice activism? And that is a question for the whole panel, so anyone can jump in, or indeed if you wanted to say something in response to what Sheila has already said, you'd be most welcome.
I can have a go.
Thank you. Sure.
It's definitely not an answer, but it's a reckon. Yeah, the working on climate change and any of these kind of systematic injustices is exhausting and dispiriting, and that relationship of kind of building personal resilience and activism is a really difficult one to get right, and is not one that I think I've got right long term. It's overwhelming, and the interlinkages between all those things and the scale of trying to kind of fix them all at once. But I think there is you obviously have to take power and energy from that realization as well, and the kind of the different amazing kind of stories of resistance and movements and all the wonderful things that are happening in that kind of many varied intersectional, interrelated kind of movement of movements is wonderful, and you can take, or I can take, a lot of energy from that. I mean, I don't have it's a particularly relevant question for me at the moment, because I am particularly exhausted and dispirited at the moment, and I'm about to take some time off to see if I can kind of get out of repeating patterns of behaviour and thinking that aren't, are making me miserable and aren't helping me kind of be resilient in this work. So hopefully that's a good idea. But I did think of some things that kind of have helped me in the last few weeks, like practical things that have kind of kept me going, especially since the pandemic started. One is, whenever I'm feeling powerless or overwhelmed, I try and name 5 things that I can do right now, even if they're only small, to do something to help, whether that's helping a friend or helping my community or helping my neighbours, or trying to find out about something else in the world. 5 things that I can do right now that can help in some way. I try and answer, I've got a couple of questions that I can ask myself to try and put myself in a more positive place, which over time I think makes me more resilient. So I ask myself, where is my favourite place right now? And I describe it and I think about it, and that really helps. And I think about, what do I appreciate about myself, and think about what I'm really appreciate about myself, and I find that helps. And I also, a technique that one of my friends taught me was recognizing that while all these feelings I have of when faced with the climate crisis and colonialism and racism and sexism and all of that, when it's overwhelming and I feel sorrow and anger, that there's a real the flip side to those emotions are really positive things. So I feel sorrow because I'm compassionate, and that's a good thing. And I feel anger because I want justice, and that's a good thing. And so it's kind of reminding myself that they're that there are these positive sides to really negative emotions, I think is a really
something earlier. I'm sorry, Mum.
I think it's all right. I think someone just needs to be muted, perhaps. Great. Sorry, carry on, Rachel.
That was me done. It was good timing.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for your honesty in sharing where you're at, and I think it really is a common problem. I had it, and and I know of others, and I think that's why we're having a whole panel on resilience later. But I really wanted to name it in this session as a very difficult thing when you're facing and working on something that is an emergency and that feels so overwhelming that it gets very hard to sort of not destroy yourself while trying to save the planet, which, you know, I kind of personally came to the view that those two things, they cannot work together. You cannot destroy yourself and save the planet, that there's a kind of inherent cyclical almost bringing in of the system, even though you're trying to do it in a positive way to try and change it. There's certain elements that can be very harmful and aren't helpful even for the broader work. But did anyone else on the panel want to sort of share thoughts on this? Sheila?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. As I shared at the beginning, I definitely am familiar with burnout. It's definitely something that I experienced being in part of through my activism, and something that I've really noticed in activist culture is that often there can be a sort of a sense of heroism, there's a moral duty to do everything that we can to address all the injustices in the world. There's an altruistic sense of needing to save the planet and to save others. There's often some of that can be fueled by feelings of guilt and shame, especially if, you know, as we become more aware of the privileges that we hold. But there's also this huge tendency to see ourselves as less important, and I guess moreover there's a tendency to sort of have a sense of that it's self-indulgent to focus on ourselves, and I guess we see that the ills of society are so much bigger and the stakes are so much higher than any problem we might be struggling with in our daily lives. So, you know, it just kind of reinforces that idea that, you know, the work out there is always much bigger than the work that we need to do for ourselves, and it's always inevitably much bigger than the capacity that we have, because we always want to do more. And there's always more that can be done, and more that we have capacity. So we burn out, and it's just really, really common amongst activists, activist culture. Adding to that, the sort of hopelessness and disparity that people feel, the despair around dealing with such issues that are so big, and I think also I've come across people talking about self-care as a privilege, and I think that's quite an important thing to maybe talk about. That for some people, obviously, it's not a choice that they have to be able to focus on their self-care. But if those of us who do have that privilege, choose not to take care of ourselves, then we are willingly replicating the violence of systemic oppressions, and we are doing the work of patriarchy and capitalism on ourselves, and we are ultimately decreasing our capacity to do the work of fighting injustice. And as you said, if we burn out, we're not good to anyone or for any cause, and the consequences of burnout aren't just oh, I'm a bit burnt out and then you pop back a couple of months later. The consequences are quite long. So I think also, I hear amongst activist culture, particularly lots of kind of ideas around what does it mean, what is self-care, and I think it's also important to dispel the myths that it's not just about spas and yoga, and it's not even just about meditation, or it's and personal resilience isn't all about being hardy or living minimally. And whilst these are important things to include, they definitely can include these. I think in the context of our wider activism, self-care and personal resilience is about committing to our own spiritual, emotional, psychological growth, so that we can build our personal capacities to do the work of fighting for climate justice. And so I think, the idea that self-care is all about pampering ourselves is part of the reason why some people really want to distance themselves from that, because that just feels really indulgent, right? So I think that there are different ways that we can look at what self-care is. And I also think that it's not an either or thing. You know, I've definitely heard people saying, oh, I need to sort myself out. I sort myself out, and then I can kind of concentrate on saving the planet or doing this or doing that. I need to sort myself out. But I don't see that I think that's a false binary. I don't see that it's an either or thing. I think that doing self-reflective work, where we look at our own biases and our privileges and our complicities in contributing to injustices, I think is also a part of that in terms of building our personal resilience. I think cultivating gratitude and humility in order to use those privileges constructively is also a really important part. And I think we need to be interested and educate ourselves about the perspectives of people like us in order for us to grow and as individuals and to be able to be bigger, to be able to kind of do the work better. I guess in terms of my own burnout, I spoke about being the only brown face in my environmental spaces, and it definitely contributed to my sense of burnout, to my burnout, that journey into burnout, because I definitely felt like I wanted others to be interested in my experience, which I didn't necessarily feel was happening, and that made me feel othered and marginalized, or my perspective. And so I withdrew, but as I withdrew and I educated myself, and I've actually, really inspired and really compelled to kind of share that and use that to kind of help or going through that, or even grappling with some of the complexities of fighting injustices. But it's important, in saying that I don't want to be as a person of colour, I don't want to be the only source of information. I think it's really important that I want others to also take responsibility for that, and then I can be motivated to sharing my experiences to kind of help the growth of others. I think it's about taking responsibility for that and seeing it as an act, self-care as an act of kind of personal growth.
Great, thanks so much, Sheila. Lots of really wise thinking and responses there, and I'm also reminded hearing you about just hearing the daughter of Berta Cáceres speak, and she's an Indigenous activist. It was an event in America, so obviously before COVID. She'd been detained, I think, by US security for 6 hours before she could even arrive to speak at this event, even though she was a keynote speaker. And she spoke of a lot of hardship, but she also had a lot of joy. There was just a lot of joy inherent in her, and in that, and it was a really powerful thing to see, actually. And I find I do, in the circumstances when I've met or heard Indigenous people speaking, there is that ability to really centre on the hardship and the struggle and the importance of that, but also to be in joy. And I think there's something that we as a Western society somehow have lost there, that I think is a thing worth exploring. But we have an entire final session on this. I'm hoping that all our speakers here and all of you will join us for that, but I did want to touch on this now. So we're going to now move on into our breakout groups. You'll automatically be put into one. If you don't want to be put into one, you can just refuse. Great. Okay, so now we're moving on to the part of this session where we hear from you by your questions. So Christabel's been collating those, and she's been through them, and we've got about 20 minutes now, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can. So Christabel, if you'd like to fire away.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists. It's been fascinating. Okay, so first question, it says, my impression is that people are daunted by complexity. How do we make the shift towards a more intersectional perspective? What helpful steps do you see to move towards that? Shall I read that again?
That's
so
good.
my impression is that people are daunted by complexity. How do we make the shift towards a more intersectional perspective? What helpful steps do you see to move towards that? Who's going to jump in?
Yes, so panel, you might have to, because I can't see you all on the same screen at the moment, so I don't quite know what to do that other than toggling back and forth and trying to find you. So if you wouldn't mind just piping up, that would be easier, and then we can always sort it out if you all speak at the same time.
Mm-hmm. I'm happy to say some stuff. I suppose, sorry, can you just repeat the question one more time? Because I kind of had a little bit of a tech thing.
Yeah, my impression is that people are daunted by complexity. How do we make the shift towards a more intersectional perspective? What are some of the helpful steps towards that? So a good question.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, for me, in terms of like moving towards an intersectional way of like working with climate change, is changing the way that we're talking about climate change, I think, is definitely a key step. So like that's something that we can do straight away. So for example, if we want to be talking about we want to talk about clean energy and sustainable infrastructures, then we can do that in the context of talking about the need to create secure jobs in industries that don't destroy the environment, or if we want to talk about green jobs in the context of sort of not just like localized green jobs like retrofitting and insulating existing homes, etc., that sort of stuff, or talking about people who are dying each winter because they can't afford to heat their homes. Like we can, instead of just talking about carbon emissions, we can talk about carbon emissions, but in the context of social inequalities about who's responsible for causing those emissions, or in the context of austerity and cuts, or the subsidising of industries that contribute to those carbon emissions. We can talk about the health impacts of climate change, and we can talk about that in the context of like race, class, gender, and physical ability, because obviously this impacts different people differently. So I think like how we talk about climate change is definitely it's definitely a way of like shifting our thinking and our analysis to kind of moving towards an intersectional way of approaching the subject. And then that comes alongside, just, being open, informing ourselves, educating ourselves. I was on a conference, a webinar recently about aviation, the degrowth of aviation, and like a sort of anti-aviation expansion campaign, and I was talking about the need to hear people, like to understand the perspectives of people who are not like us. And somebody said, well, where do I find those people? And it's like, people not like you are everywhere. And so it doesn't mean that we have to then go and like not do anything on climate change until we're an expert on racism, or until we're an expert on global poverty. It's like we need to just keep informing ourselves, and keep refining the way that we're talking about climate change, and the way that we're having a kind of feedback system, a kind of reflective cycle, so that we're like being able to constantly grow and review the way that we're working on climate change, and accept that we'll get it wrong, and that we'll keep doing it, like learn from that and keep getting it better. And so I think that's.
Thank you so much, Sheila.
Sorry, can I jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if anyone else wanted to, so absolutely.
Thanks. So just building on that as well, I think that, like, if you're a climate activist or you care about the climate in any way, or you're like, you have any sort of feeling towards this emergency we are seeing, you understand complexity. Like, if you can understand kind of the chemical and the ecological reactions that we're seeing as part of the like shifts in nature that are affecting us badly, then you can understand how different people and their different backgrounds kind of play into it. Like, I think that, when we talk to people, we try first break it down as easy as possible to kind of draw them in, and then we try and build it up more and more and like explore it more. But I think, like, in a way, like the way we are taught at schools, for example, it's like it distills away all the nuances of things. And I think, like, in a way, we have to kind of embrace that things aren't just, as simple as they can be, or like things aren't just in one discipline, they're multidisciplinary. And I think once we start breaking away from that and we start kind of tearing down these, like, kind of binaries and labels that we put on things, we can kind of get there. So we're seeing that now, like, for example, when it comes to issues of gender, there's been like a bigger understanding now, or there's been a building understanding that, genders aren't binary, and they've never been binary. It's just that we've had this understanding of them as being such. But more and more people are waking up to the fact that we have a multitude of genders, and this is people's lived experiences. So it's like, it's a matter of like taking in the knowledge that's out there, because people are kind of open about these things and being accepting of it. And it's also about like not accepting labels. And I think, like, if you care about the climate, you've already gotten that. You just have to start integrating that, like, thinking, I guess, into the way you look at social structures as well, because they can seem very like set in stone, but they're actually not. And I'd just like to draw it back to something that Nick said at the start. And it's like the issues that we're seeing today, they're not there by accident. They're almost like designed to be that way. Like, there's almost a design that some people need to be marginalized and silenced for the system to work. So more than ever, if you want to be an ally and you want to understand the complexity of it, it's like you have to, like, take a step back, listen, internalize the things that are being spoken, and then, like, move on to them in the world. You have to see the other as like as a fully realized human being, and think, how can I act in a way that is very kind of empathic and but also like with action, because it's about action. You can kind of listen and leave it there, but it's also about like, how can I work with you to solve this issue? How can I stand by your side? And then you take it from there. And I think we all have that. It's just that it's so much easier to just fall back on these binaries and these labels. But I think we are getting there. We're all hacking away at them. We just need to kind of accelerate it a little bit more.
Thanks, Hiba. And I guess the advantage is that once you start seeing these different bits of the puzzle pieces, you can understand a whole range of issues from these different lenses. So it might be harder to begin with, but then it helps as a framework going forward when you start to understand these different pieces of the puzzle. Does anyone else on the panel want to comment on this? No? Okay, then let's go to our next question.
Next question is, does a carbon tax have a role, and then in brackets, to stop the export from UK of carbon intensive production to developing nations?
Okay, great, thanks. I think I'll pose that one to Nick, if that sounds okay. Is that something you'd like to?
Yeah, it sounds like, are you talking about like a carbon border adjustment tax, which has been discussed quite a bit. And there are pros and cons. I mean, the EU is talking about this at the moment. So basically it's saying, how do you deal with the fact that some countries don't have the same level of environmental protection, of fossil fuel reduction targets as others? Because if you just had, for example, a free trade agreement and you allowed import of stuff made in the United States, once the United States has opted out of the Paris Agreement and isn't paying any attention to any kind of targets, they will just outcompete parts of the British economy. So from that perspective, it's a good idea. The problem is how you deal with the fact that developing countries are allowed to emit more for a future period of time than already developed countries are. So, because if you simply put an adjustment tax on, that would basically penalize all of those economies. So that is, and you can't discriminate on the WTO rules. So there's lots of toing and froing on this at the moment. I think it's got merits, but I think it can only be done as part of a much wider package of measures that would also ensure proper reparations to developing countries, proper support for mitigation and adaptation strategies within developing countries. And we need to do that anyway. I mean, the amount of money that's been promised year on year on year at various COPs for however long about the rich countries need to support the poorer countries who do not have the atmospheric space left because we've used it all in our own development for their development, and therefore we need to assist to ensure that they